Hello, my name is Hugh Paterson, and I'm presenting at the Language Documentation and Archiving Conference, um, whose theme is Where Do We Go From Here? The title of my presentation is OLAC Collections, the case of serials, and the focus of my talk is where do we go from here with serials and their indexing in OLAC. So by serials, what do I mean? Well, I mean regular publications, working papers, journals, conference proceedings, anything with an ISSN number. Now, these types of resources are significantly important or increasingly significantly important because they often relate to the collections of resources developed in language documentation, and they often contain the descriptions of those collections. We've seen an increase of publications of these in language documentation, conservation, and other journals. Now, for those of you who may be aware of the OLAC, and OLAC is the metadata schema is a refinement of the Dublin Core, and it gets a lot of its power from Dublin Core. But Dublin Core's DCMI type does not have a special value or vocabulary item for serials. And so this creates a bit of a problem. And it's not just a problem for OLAC, but many institutional repositories that I've visited, I've seen at least 5 different strategies for addressing this. It means that interoperability on this level is not widely available, and some have, in fact, rejected Dublin Core as being suitable for describing serials and journal articles and such. I would like to take a different approach, a different perspective, and this is also found in the literature. But it means asking the question, what is being described? Is it the serial, meaning the whole journal, the volume, the issue, or the article? And when we think about it this way, we would possibly create 4 different types of records and then link them. It means that relationships take on a very important component in the future of OLAC aggregation and even in the OLAC user interface. When we think about it, OLAC has about 400,000 items in it right now. But there are other aggregators out there, or other collections of resources, such as Linguistic Abstracts Online, that has over 760,000 items. That's more than the Glottolog. And to the point of OLAC, well, only 65% of the items in OLAC are even describable as having an identifiable language associated with them. In fact, one of the language resource description journal articles I'll show later in the presentation, it doesn't even have, so it describes a specific language collection, and it's not identified with that particular language. So it won't show up in the language page as an associated resource. So my questions that motivated this research were twofold. How are journal articles currently described in OLAC, and how might journal articles best be described in OLAC? One's a practical practice question, and the other is a theoretical question. So when we look at DCMI type collections, I recently published a paper on this, so I refer my audience to that paper. But I'll briefly overview that is that DCMI type does have this term collection, and it basically means anything that's more than one record's worth. And there is a guidance in the Dublin Core application, the documentation, to say, well, one item should get one record. So the collection should be applied to archival collections, the records that pertain to the entire collection, and then sub-records should be linked with a relationship. And it can also be a collection can also be applied to aggregate works, like an edited volume or a journal series, the entire journal. And so it's important to here to say there are some things that are not collections. An archive is not a collection. A data provider to OLAC is not a collection. Now, data providers may index more than one collection, or they may only index one collection. So keeping these conceptually independent is very important to clear communication inside of a user interface that might use metadata to guide users to the resources that they're most interested in. It's also important to realize that aggregates can come in different types, many different types, but importantly, they can come in same type for the modality, like a text type, or same different in such as an audio and a text together, where linguists might use something like a transcription and an oral story. So when we look at the logical structure of how this might work with Dublin Core metadata, we would have a record for the entire serial, then it would have a relationship to another record and is part of or has part relationship would be established with a volume, and the same with the issue and the same with the article. Now, articles can come in several different versions, or in library science terms, we would call it an expression or a manifestation. So a different expression might be a preprint. And let's assume that it was just an article, that it was just a run-of-the-mill article and describing some sort of grammatical component of a language. So a preprint might have the Dublin Core has version or is version of to relate the final published version with a preprint. Now, if that article was perhaps much more technical in the computational technical side, it might have used some software in its analysis, and it might have used a data set. Those would best be independently described as independent with independent records and then referenced, both in the bibliography of the article and in the Dublin Core metadata with the referenced or is referenced relation element. Now, some articles are complex depending on the publisher. Some have supplemental materials that are co-published with the article. So in this case, then, the article wouldn't be a text, wouldn't have the text type of DCMI text as the previous discussion of article would have had, but rather we would apply collection to this as well. So this article is a collection of artifacts, and we would describe the article and its supplement and have two records for that. And in this case, when that's the case, a preprint of that would only directly relate to the text. And so you could take a text, right, and you could put it in a PDF form, you could put it in a device that would paginate differently. So you can have different manifestations of text. So that approaching manifestations is something we need to think about critically in OLAC. Now, when we're looking at OLAC data, it's a couple of things to be aware of. The first is that that there can be some variation in the records, and this is for a variety of reasons. The question to ask about the data when we see it is the practice at the OLAC provider for description of their entrusted resources adequate? So description practices across providers vary, and whether or not they implement everything in Dublin Core and everything in the modifier vocabularies that are provided through OLAC, maybe they do, maybe they don't. It doesn't prevent them from participating. And there's another question then is the crosswalk from the way they host and manage their metadata to the way they provide it to OLAC done appropriately, or with at the appropriate, well, this metadata over here equals that, and crosswalking. So then the third thing is OLAC application profile currently descriptive enough for what the institution has described? And that's where we are in some of our discussion here. what comes in the future, what comes next. So this is the OLAC record for a guide to the Sayaiba language documentation course. And one of the things that we can note right off the bat is that this was published, this record's provided from the University of Hawaii's Language Documentation and Conservation Journal, which is, I think, the only journal that directly puts their publishings into OLAC. So it's a great thing that we have a journal that participates in this. However, there are, I think, some technical errors in the crosswalk. Look at the bibliographic citation. The elements are confusing, but if we look down at the identifier for the resource is actually the bibliographic citation. So I think there's some errors here that we're seeing. Now, we do have only one text type, text DCMI type, which is text, and that's a good thing. But there's no linking between this record and the artifacts described. I think that's a major oversight in how we provide records to and references to OLAC, other records inside of OLAC. Now, looking at other examples of published journal articles, the one on the left here, translated Messiah, Christ, and Lamb of God, provided by SIL, it has some confusion in the extent field. And in the relation field, it has the name of the journal series, but it doesn't have a link to that because the provider did not provide a record for the volume or the issue or the journal. Now, the MPI provides another record on the right, and this one in the title has the title of the entire issue or volume, whatever it is. It has no date field, but inside the title is a date. So parsing here is could be improved, I would think. I would think that those would be separate fields in the host's actual data. I haven't checked that, but this is how it appears in OLAC. Now, a second thing here is that they have three components. They have an audio file, a Elan file, and then they have a PDF. Now, they provide two DCMI types, sound and text. But here, this should be a collection. It should be because they should have a one-to-one mapping for each item and then associate those together with a collection, even if it's a journal article. Now, there's a couple here that are in the online slides, and so there's some annotation here. You can look at those more detailed on the online slides. I do also provide a data set in Zenodo for several of these exported records that you can look at the XML in. In this particular case, this is another case where it's a journal article, and there's also a map involved. The journal article ends up, the bibliographic citation ends up in the description. This is very common for how things are parsed out in the European Language Resource Association's data feed. There's and several other feeds have journal article. They'll say something about a corpus, and then they'll say, as described in the journal article in the description. That would best be suited as a relation, and the article would be a second object inside the OLAC universe of records. Now, here's another one from Hawaii, and I think this is a parse error where we have what is essentially the description and the bibliographic citation both large. Now, in contrast to being an article, this is a representation for something from the conference. So this is a proceedings. Now, proceedings are sometimes given ISSNs, so that would also fall under serials. So we should take a look at see with those with more detail. So the outstanding issues are extent declarations, ambiguous identifiers, stable identifiers for serial components for journals. I mean, if so we should think about, well, should OLAC just provide some stable identifiers for serials for the entire like journal series? A policy on records related to items without possession. So if I don't have it in my holdings, but I'm referencing it, how should that, what kind of guidance can we provide data providers for that? And a need to provide with comply with the Dublin Core's one-to-one principle, which is found in the implementation documentation of Dublin Core, and upon which OLAC builds. So, and we see some inconsistencies across the same providers. So I appreciate your attention and anticipate some great questions. Thank you very much.